Welcome to my latest Team Unicorn chat, and I'm delighted to have alongside me 2015 PDC World Champion, the Flying Scotsman himself, Gary Anderson.
Hi, I'm Raymond van Barneveld and this is my Team Unicorn Double Dart Challenge.
Hi, I'm Michael Smith. This is my Team Unicorn Double Dart Challenge.
For over 2 decades, Unicorn wasn't just part of darts, they were darts. The greatest players, the biggest moments, the boards every champion trusted, and then they lost it all. Not in some sudden scandal, but in a slow, brutal collapse that everyone saw coming, except them. This is how the most dominant brand in darts history went from ruling the stage to barely even making it to the pub. By the late 2000s, Unicorn wasn't just a big name in darts, they were the name. If you were watching a major match on TV, chances were every dart you saw thrown was made by them. They didn't just sponsor a few pros, they had the pros. Phil Taylor, Adrian Lewis, James Wade, Gary Anderson, Raymond van Barneveld. It was like they'd scooped up the entire top of the rankings and put them all under one banner. In 2011, they held contracts with 7 of the world's top 8 players, a level of market control almost unheard of in any sport. And Unicorn didn't stop at players. They stacked their team with the personalities that made darts, well, darts. Legendary referee Russ Bray, whose game on could shake an arena. Sid Waddle, the voice of darts, a man who could turn a routine leg into a moment of history with a single sentence. These weren't just partnerships, they were statements. Unicorn wasn't just selling equipment, they were curating the culture of the sport itself. But their real crown jewel wasn't a player or commentator or even a personality, it was a dartboard, the Eclipse Pro. Since 1997, it had been the official PDC board. Every major televised event, every nail-biting finish, every perfect 9-darter, all of it played out on a Unicorn board. That logo was more than branding, it was a badge of authenticity. If it wasn't on a Unicorn board, did it even count? For over 2 decades, the biggest moments in the game happened with their product literally at the center of the stage. And they weren't just there, they were dominant. If you were a fan, you didn't think about whether a player was using Unicorn equipment. Of course they were. That was the default. If you were a young player dreaming of making it to the top, signing with Unicorn was like getting knighted. It meant you'd arrived. By 2011, the brand was so ingrained in the sport that their dominance felt permanent. When Gary Anderson signed that year, just weeks before winning the Premier League, it wasn't seen as a bold move. It was seen as inevitable. Of course Unicorn got him. Of course another top name joined the club. That's just what happened, and that's the danger. When you've been on top for that long, you start to believe there's no way down. You stop worrying about competition because you've beaten them for so long, it's hard to even imagine them catching up. You think the peak is the new baseline, but in sports and in business, the peak is rarely the start of a plateau. More often, it's the beginning of a decline, and for Unicorn, that decline was about to start, quietly, unexpectedly, and from a player they'd built up as the future of the sport. It happened in 2011, right when Unicorn seemed untouchable. They had the legends, they had the stage, they had the next generation locked in. And right in the middle of all that dominance, their chosen future walked out the door. Adrian Lewis wasn't just another young talent, he was the young talent. At just 25, he'd lifted the World Championship trophy, playing fearless, aggressive darts with the confidence of a man twice his age. And crucially, he was doing it all with Unicorn gear in his hand. For the brand, he wasn't just a star, he was their insurance policy. Phil Taylor was still a titan, but he wouldn't be on top forever. Lewis was the bridge to the future. That's why the news hit like a sledgehammer. 10 months after winning his first world title, Lewis announced he was leaving Unicorn for Target Darts, a company that, at the time, barely registered as a threat. It wasn't just a contract change, it was a public declaration that Unicorn wasn't the only game in town anymore. And Lewis didn't exactly leave quietly. In his official statement, he said, "Target made the best darts in the business." One sentence, and Unicorn's carefully cultivated image as the premium brand took a direct hit. This wasn't an anonymous online review. This was their hand-picked golden boy bearing them in front of the entire sport. The humiliation didn't stop there. Just 3 months after switching, Lewis defended his world title, this time throwing Target darts. On live TV, in front of millions, the man Unicorn had built up as their future proved he could win without them. That wasn't just a win for Lewis or for Target, it was an open wound for Unicorn. Inside the industry, people noticed. Players talk, managers talk. Suddenly, the idea that Unicorn was the only path to the top didn't seem so obvious anymore. Target, the upstart brand, now had a back-to-back world champion as their figurehead, and Unicorn had a hole in their future. But while Lewis leaving hurt, it wasn't the end of the world. Unicorn still had Phil Taylor, the most dominant player in darts history, and as long as he stayed, the brand's dominance felt safe. The problem? He wasn't going to stay. Phil Taylor wasn't just a unicorn player, he was unicorn. 16 world titles, dozens of majors, and more records than anyone could count. All of it achieved with a unicorn dart in his hand. For nearly 2 decades, his dominance was their dominance. Every time he won, their logo was right there, riding shotgun with history. That's why, when rumors started swirling in late 2013 that Taylor might be leaving, most fans dismissed it outright. Surely not the power. Surely not after everything he and Unicorn had achieved together. It was unthinkable. But it happened. In January 2014, Target Darts announced they had signed Phil Taylor to a 5-year deal reportedly worth £3 million. The biggest contract in darts history at the time. For Unicorn, it was more than just losing their best player. It was the symbolic shattering of their empire. If Phil Taylor could walk away, anyone could. And it didn't end cleanly. Even after Taylor left, Unicorn continued selling the Power branded darts under a new line called the Evolution of the Power. Taylor didn't take it lightly. He reportedly sued them for $100,000, arguing they had no right to profit off his nickname after the split. Suddenly, what had been a decades-long partnership turned into a public, bitter legal fight. This was a turning point. Losing Lewis had been painful. Losing Taylor was catastrophic. And losing him to the same company that had taken Lewis, with a record-breaking contract no less, was like watching their biggest rival build a fortress out of their own bricks. For the first time in decades, Unicorn looked vulnerable, and the rest of the darts world could smell blood. Once Phil Taylor was gone, something shifted in the darts world. Players who had been with Unicorn for years, even decades, started to look around. If the power could leave, anyone could. The loyalty that had once kept their roster together began to unravel, not in one big explosion, but in a slow, methodical drip. The next major loss was Raymond van Barneveld, a 5-time world champion. Barney wasn't just a player, he was an icon, especially in Europe. He'd signed with Unicorn in 2009 on a 6-figure deal that was considered massive at the time. But in 2017, after 8 years with the company, he followed Taylor to Target. His parting words were a dagger. Target darts feel amazing, look fantastic, and come in great packaging. Another public endorsement for their rival, and another signal that Unicorn no longer held the monopoly on quality. Then came Dimitri van den Berg. Unicorn had signed him as a teenager in 2014, investing years in his development. He delivered, winning the 2020 World Match Play and back-to-back World Series events in 2022. But just months after those wins, he was gone, signing with Target. Chris Dobie's story was eerily similar. He joined Unicorn in 2016, climbed the ranks, and by 2023 had made the Premier League and won his first major. The same year, he left. Joe Cullen, a Unicorn loyalist since 2008, walked in 2020 after 12 years. Kim Huybrechts, Devon Peterson, John Part, all gone. And then came the most brutal blow of all, Michael Smith. Bully Boy had been with Unicorn for a decade, rising from world number 34 to world champion and world number 1 in 2023. Every major win of his career had been with Unicorn Darts, and yet, just weeks after winning the biggest prize in the sport, he left. Even more damning, he'd already signed with Shot Darts, a much smaller company, months before lifting the trophy. He didn't even wait to see if Unicorn would make a counteroffer. That's how little faith he had left in the brand's future. By this point, the message from the pros was deafening. Players weren't leaving for bigger paychecks. They were leaving because they believed Unicorn couldn't take them further. And once that belief is gone, money can't buy it back. Losing players hurt, but the next problem came from somewhere even more dangerous, their own products. For decades, the Eclipse Pro dartboard had been the gold standard. Players trusted it, fans recognized it. It had been hanging on PDC stages since the late 90s, a constant presence in the sport's biggest moments. But over time, that reputation began to crack, literally. Fans started noticing more bounce outs, darts hitting the board cleanly and still falling to the floor. At first, it was brushed off as bad luck or isolated incidents, but then the pros started speaking up, and not just any pros, their own sponsored players. In 2019, Michael Smith, still under contract with Unicorn, tweeted during a televised event, "Sort the boards out, these bounce outs are ridiculous." It wasn't a quiet behind-the-scenes complaint, it was a public call out to millions of viewers and to his own sponsor. Others joined in. Simon Whitlock, known for using aggressive dart points, said Unicorn boards wore down far faster than their competitors, particularly Windmill. Even the legendary Eric Bristow voiced his frustration. The nickname, the Unibounce, started circulating among fans online, and slow-motion clips began going viral. Perfect throws hitting the wire and tumbling out. Commentators aired their own irritation during matches. Suddenly, the Eclipse Pro wasn't the board you trusted, it was the board you dreaded, and for a company whose brand identity was built on quality and prestige, that was lethal. The final humiliation came in 2022. After 25 years of partnership, the PDC quietly ended its deal with Unicorn. The boards would no longer be used in major televised events. The official explanation? Unicorn claimed they had chosen not to renew, instead focusing on the amateur market. But the timing was too convenient, right after years of public criticism, player departures, and growing competitor dominance. To many, it looked less like a pivot and more like they'd been pushed off the stage. And in darts, losing the stage is like losing oxygen. Without it, you don't just fade, you disappear. When Unicorn lost the PDC board contract in 2022, it wasn't just a business decision, it was a public unmasking. For 25 years, the Eclipse Pro had been the dartboard of professional darts. It wasn't just hanging in arenas, it was part of the sport's DNA. To see it vanish from the main stage without fanfare was like watching a long-standing champion quietly slip out of the arena before the final bell. The official story was polite, even optimistic. Unicorn claimed they'd made the conscious decision to step away from professional sponsorship and refocus on the amateur game. They rolled out a new campaign called For Every Player, complete with research from YouGov showing that most darts players prefer to play at home or in pubs rather than follow the pro circuit. The message was clear, they weren't retreating, they were shifting focus. But for the fans, the timing spoke louder than the press release. You don't make a big strategic pivot right after losing your top players, your product reputation, and your TV stage, unless you have to. To many, it felt like a spin job. Unicorn hadn't walked away from the big stage by choice, they'd been edged out, and by the time they announced the pivot, there was nothing left to pivot from. The amateur-focused campaign sounded noble on paper, affordable boards, accessible gear, more grassroots involvement, but the details were vague. Accessibility could mean a lot of things. Lower prices, simplified products, cheaper manufacturing, none of which rebuild prestige in a pro market, and prestige had been the one thing keeping Unicorn ahead for decades. Meanwhile, their rivals were thriving in the space Unicorn had vacated. Windmill boards now hung in every major PDC event, beaming their logo into millions of homes worldwide. Target continued signing the sport's biggest names. Even Shot Darts, a much smaller player, had made headlines by snapping up Michael Smith fresh off his world title. For Unicorn, losing the stage wasn't just about losing visibility, it was losing relevance. In a sport where every fan watches the gear their heroes use, absence from the spotlight means absence from the conversation, and once that happens, the climb back is almost impossible. Today, the Unicorn that once ruled darts is a shadow of its former self. In the current PDC rankings, only one Unicorn-sponsored player sits in the top 10. Their highest-ranked names are James Wade at number 5 and Ross Smith at number 14. Talented players, no doubt, but no longer the marquee stars that command the world's attention. Gary Anderson is still there, still dangerous on his day, but his peak years are behind him. Their boards, no longer seen on TV, no longer the gold standard, no longer the default choice for pros. Among casual players, reviews are increasingly lukewarm, with criticism ranging from declining build quality to outdated designs and poor value compared to competitors. What was once a premium brand is now, for many, just another name on the shelf. Meanwhile, their competitors have filled the void. Target has built an all-star roster and dominates the sponsorship game. Windmill controls the pro stage through the PDC. Shot Darts, once a niche New Zealand brand, now boasts the reigning world champion. In the space Unicorn once owned outright, there's now a vibrant competitive marketplace, and Unicorn isn't leading it. Perhaps the most telling sign of the shift is this. When young players dream of turning pro today, Unicorn isn't the obvious end goal. 15 years ago, signing with them was a career milestone. Now, it's a nostalgia trip, a reminder of what used to mean you'd made it. It didn't have to go this way. Unicorn had the players, the products, the stage, everything you need to dominate for another generation. but they failed to adapt, clung to their past while ignoring the future, and let rivals rewrite the playbook right in front of them. By the time they tried to change course, the game had already moved on without them. And in darts, just like in sport, business, or life, if you're not moving forward, you're falling behind. Unikrn didn't fall because of one bad decision. They fell because of 1,000 small ones, made slowly, quietly, and without vision. The result? A giant of the game now reduced to chasing relevance in the very sport it once defined. When you look back at Unikrn's fall, it's tempting to pin it on one big moment: Adrian Lewis leaving, Phil Taylor's blockbuster Target deal, the Eclipse Pro's bounce-out controversy, the loss of the PDC stage. But the truth is, none of those single events killed Unikrn on their own. This wasn't a cliff drop collapse, it was erosion. A slow, grinding loss of relevance built on tiny decisions that didn't feel fatal at the time. It's easy to dismiss a single player leaving when you still have the rest of the top 10. It's easy to shrug off a few complaints about your boards when you've been the standard for decades. It's easy to believe you can pivot to the amateur market when your pro roster is thinning out. But all those moments add up. Unikrn's first mistake was complacency. They'd been on top for so long that dominance started to feel permanent. They didn't push innovation in their products the way competitors like Target did. They didn't anticipate that younger players, the future of the sport, would be drawn to brands that felt modern, stylish, and relentlessly forward-looking. Their second mistake was relationship management. Public departures are damaging, but public endorsements of your rivals from your own former stars? That's worse. Every time a player left and praised another brand's products, it chipped away at Unikrn's reputation, and instead of aggressively countering that narrative with their own big signings or product breakthroughs, Unikrn seemed to retreat further into silence. Their third mistake was misreading the importance of prestige. They assumed the amateur market could be their safety net, but in darts, prestige flows from the pros down to the pubs and garages. People want to use what the champions use. When you lose the champions and the stage they play on, you lose the ability to set trends. You're no longer the brand that defines the game, you're just there. And perhaps the most painful truth, every single warning sign was visible years in advance. The cracks started small, but they were there for anyone paying attention. It wasn't that Unikrn couldn't stop the fall, it's that they didn't. Today, Unikrn is still alive. They still sell darts, they still have distribution, they still have a handful of well-known names, but the empire, the one that owned the stage, the players, and the prestige of the sport, that's gone. Their story isn't one of a single knockout punch. It's the story of a champion who stayed in the ring too long, refusing to adapt while their opponents trained harder, fought smarter, and took the spotlight for themselves. And by the time Unikrn realized the fight was slipping away, the crowd had already turned its attention to someone else. Could they come back? Technically, yes. The brand recognition is still there. The nostalgia is still there. One massive signing or revolutionary product could put them back in the conversation, but the question isn't whether they can come back, it's whether they want to. And judging by the last few years, the answer might be no, because making darts for everyone sounds nice. But prestige is not for everyone. It's won in the glare of the TV lights, in the pressure of championship legs, in the moments fans never forget. Unikrn used to own those moments. Now, they watch from the sidelines. The catastrophic failure of Unikrn darts wasn't a sudden implosion, it was a slow-motion tragedy, and everyone saw it coming. And if you think this was bad, wait until you hear how another titan of darts, the British Darts Organisation, collapsed in a way that was even messier, louder, and far more scandalous. Click here to watch our deep dive into the BDO's downfall and find out why its end made Unikrn's look almost graceful.